Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about photographing artwork, and we're going to go through it step by step. The first thing you want to do is calibrate your environment before you receive an artwork. And in this case, we're talking about artwork you might be photographing for clients like a museum or a private collection. And you can use this absolutely to photograph your own artwork, but we're going to assume that you're doing this as a photographer for a job. So the first thing you want to do is calibrate your environment before you receive any artwork. And the first thing I do is calibrate the monitor so that we know that what we're looking at is accurate. And photographing artwork is kind of a nitpicky thing. And then I'm saving a workspace here. And especially if you're on an institutional computer, you'll want to do that. And then you want to prep all your tools, make sure that your surface is clean. You want to put down a fresh, clean sheet of paper. And here we're going to photograph an artwork like it's on a copy stand. And the first thing you would need to do is determine the size of the artwork and then prepare a space for it. And what you see me doing here is photographing a color chart. And that's really to determine white balance and exposure. And now I'm going to photograph the blank white surface. And what that's going to do is give us a lens correction profile, or lens cast correction, LCC. And it's going to even the light out. Here I'm putting on nitrile gloves, and I prefer to use nitrile gloves to handle the artwork rather than the cotton gloves because they don't shed and there's not a temptation to reuse them. They get kind of oily if you reuse them. Can get on the artwork. So I'm placing artwork underneath the camera, and it's a little uneven because of the D-rings on the back. It's not parallel to the lens. So I'm just going to shim that up with some plastic shims. And I was able to position the lights and the camera roughly because I already knew the size of the artwork, and that let me know how far to put the camera and how far to place the lights. So as far as lighting, we just want to start with the lights in equal distance apart and have them at 45 degrees, roughly. You're going to have to change this once you make your first capture, which I just did. And that's what we get. We get reflections and shadows that are the wrong way. So we need to put them more overhead in order to fill in the light between the paper and the frame. And we put a bounce card here to fill in the shadow that's coming off of the frame. And already we get a better result with that. If the reflection is still a problem, then you'll have to use a polarizing filter on your lens and possibly on the lights if it's really bad. So the first thing you want to do with regard to the shoot is select a lens that you know will fill the frame, and preferably a flat field lens. There's not a lot of those out there, but that's the ideal thing you'll want to use for photographing art. So we photographed the color chart, and here it is. And you can see on the second square there, let me go back, that the numbers are all roughly at 200. And that's the number that I designate that middle gray to be for a good exposure. Next thing we're going to do is look at the histogram to make sure that all the colors are within the gamut and that we have all the information there. So nothing's spiking off of the top and nothing's bunched up to the left or the right. Remember, in a histogram, the values on the left represent dark values, the values on the right represent highlight or the light values. So we want the histogram somewhere in the middle. So this looks good. We're going to set the aperture to f8. Anywhere from f8 to f11 is good. And then at 1/125th, because that blocks out all ambient light. And if you have strobes or constant lights, next you'll need to adjust the intensity of the light to match the exposure. So that's a little different than usual. So then we want to make a photograph and make sure we're filling the frame. And next, we're going to talk about sharpness. There are 3 factors involved in sharp images. There is the f-stop. You don't want to stop down too much like f22, because what happens is there's a little bit of fuzziness around the edge of the aperture blade where the light hits it and scatters. And the more you stop down and make the aperture hole smaller, the larger percentage of the image that little fuzzy ring takes up. So you want an aperture that is anywhere from f8 to f11. Next is parallelism. That refers to how parallel the picture plane is to the lens and the sensor plane. So the more parallel things are, the sharper things will be overall. And you have to use a flat field lens with artwork to get that. Here, what you can see is my flat field lens, which is a 90mm lens. And the rule there is also you want to use the longest lens you can get away with. And this mirror system that you see is just a blank mirror that I hang next to the artwork in the same plane. And then I have this filter on the left where I attached a mirror to one of my old filters. And basically what it does is give you a series of concentric rings, and you move the camera around until those rings are perfectly centered, and then you know you're parallel to the artwork. It's a device I like to use, and it's something you can make at home. So here's our finished product. In this case, it was a drawing that my grandmother did, and we just need to revisit this before we send it out for production to our client. So are the reflections addressed? It appears that they are. Is the shadow direction good? You want the shadow that's coming off of the frame to be at 45 degrees from the vertical plane. So the vertical or up and down plane of the frame should be at 45 degrees to that. So also with shadows, since we're photographing an object that's in a frame, we want to separate the art that's in the frame from the frame so that we know they're 2 separate objects. And one good way to do that is by shadow placement. So inside the frame there, we can see the shadows coming off the art, and that's good. Next is color balance. It appears to be a good balance. It's very neutral and accurate to the object. And the light, it does appear to be even. It's a little brighter in the top left corner, but that's okay. It lets us know that that's an object. So highlights are good when you're photographing objects. You just don't want them to be too blown out. One thing you can do, if you have the patience for it, is create your own color profiles. Every once in a while you have to do this, and it's really tedious, but for the most part, the profiles that come with Lightroom or Capture One are just fine, and the color balancing that you can do in Photoshop is also just fine. So then, with regard to making your files accessible to your client, you'll want to come up with a file naming scheme, preferably before you start photographing. And also, you'll want to balance that with how much information you include in the metadata. So one thing you want to consider is how much meaning you want to have within the file name. And also, you want all the file names to be the same number of characters so that they all line up. And you need something at the very bare minimum, like a unique identifier, like a number that describes that object as a unique object, like a item number or something. But on the left here, we've got good recommendations for file names. On the right, with regard to metadata, main thing you need to know there is all the metadata that you create while you're shooting an object is technical and gets embedded. And that's all really important to conservators and things like that. So with regard to output and the file that you create, the specs depend on the project. High volume projects, they tend to scale the resolution back, make them not as high a quality. But typically, you want to follow the FADGI, or FADGI, Federal Archival Digitization Guidelines Initiative specs. And they recommend you create an archival master file that is the specs that you see in the picture here. That's an uncompressed TIFF with ProPhoto color space at 16-bit, if you can shoot 16-bit, at 300 pixels per inch and unconstrained. So that's the most archival file format that you can create with a digital file. And a production master is something that it's a picture that you make for an image, like a stitched image, like a panorama photograph. So if you happen to need a bunch of pictures to make one picture, you would want to save those two. And the output files should be use neutral, which means you could revisit those files and use them for anything possible. You shouldn't overwork those types of files. And then there are the access files that you create for things like web production and anything like a JPEG. And with regard to keeping your data safe on site, at a minimum, you should have a RAID backup drive that is a redundant drive, and use verified file transfers so that you don't lose files while passing them from computer to computer. So a simple configuration would suit your purpose. On the left there, you can see that configuration. It's just a computer with a hard drive with all your files on it that's external, and then another external hard drive to back up those files in case one of them crashes. With regard to metadata, that's kind of geeky stuff, but if you're working for a client, sometimes they want you to export in those file formats. We won't address that in this class, so that is all we need to worry about.